Imagine if you were somehow unable to be what you are. I can only imagine that deep-wired gender dysphoria must feel something like that, and I imagine it's a difficulty you would want to resolve. I think it's pertinent to start by saying that transness, and by that I mean transgenderism and transsexualism, is not a new thing or something concocted by TikTokers in order to annoy their parents. It's real and it's ancient. Records of it go back as far as since we've been able to record human behavior. But statistically speaking, it is a minority condition. Averaged out over different countries, the number of trans people represents about roughly 0.8% of the population. However, when you throw modern communication into the mix, you're talking about a large body of people, raising the profile of a class that seeks to improve conditions for itself, and a culture at large that is still not sure about which requirements it can meet and which it cannot. So we have an ongoing controversy. It seems to be more concerned with trans women than with trans men, and I'm not sure why that is. Maybe there's disproportionate media attention for some reason, but that's the way it is. And so, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to focus on trans women in what follows. The criticism of trans femaleness from some sections of the feminist community can be boiled down to two particular points, one of which is suspicion about the alleged erasure of women as a distinctly disadvantaged class and the subsequent neglect of issues that affect women as a sex rather than females as a gender. In 1979, Janice Raymond's The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Male, accused male-to-female transsexuality of reinforcing traditional gender stereotypes, which is a fair point, I suppose, considering that when you decide to transition from one sex to the opposite sex, you must have certain very firm ideas about what constitutes the characteristics of that other sex. She talks about the making of woman according to man's image, describing trans women's culture as an attempt to colonize feminist identification, culture, politics, and sexuality. That seems like a degree of suspicion too far for me, but then again, I am still quite naive about this. Others have argued similarly that hormone therapy and surgery should not be considered persuasive evidence of femaleness. In 2017, feminist megastar Germaine Greer publicly reinforced her position that trans women are not, in fact, authentic women. The second issue is that of women's physical safety and the blurring of qualification when it comes to access to female spaces. Kathleen Stock, a professor of philosophy at Sussex University, exemplifies these objections by saying, trans women are male, most have penises, many fancy females. These two are facts. There are documented cases of trans women harming females. If we legally allow trans women into female-only spaces, some females will be hurt by some trans women. It's utterly predictable. This was in response to an open letter published in 2019 by a trans female graduate student at the University of California, Santa Barbara, whose name doesn't appear to be given, criticizing the stance of academia in relation to her status as a woman. In it, she says, in part, and I quote, "How can I be expected to attend professional events where people deny and question such an integral part of my identity and act like that is tolerable or normal? My gender is not up for debate. I am a woman. Any trans discourse that does not proceed from this initial assumption that trans people are the gender they say they are is oppressive, regressive, and harmful." Now, this is a perfect example of the kind of statement guaranteed to annoy the crap out of trans skeptics across the board, from radfems to heat-packing libertarians, because it touches on another main objection: language control. As Andrew Doyle puts it, it comes down to a conflict between liberty and the way that language can negatively affect minority groups. Columnist Douglas Murray puts the freedom of language issue into aggressive relief. Society is demanding that you agree to something that it's not possible to agree to and keep your self-esteem. So what is this conflict on course for? Well, in the far future, I find it very hard to believe that gender and identity expression won't become wildly more diverse, more nuanced as we approach an age of transhumanism, where technology will be able to facilitate our imagination to the extent that you really will be able to identify as attack helicopter. What will the people of that age think about our current tribulations? Very little, I expect. So what can we do that will help us survive until that age arrives in its own comfortable time? Well, as I've said about other controversies, it's a mistake to think that any side will conveniently exit the stage. We're in the ring now and we've got to hammer it out, because that's just what's going on. For people who are trans skeptical, I would say that you'll just have to recognize that transness is real and that its concerns are not petty. How would you feel if every time you used a public lavatory it felt like a potential transgression? How would you feel if you had to live with the broad perception that you are not precisely at home with either sex? How would you feel if you were unable to be what you are? Feminists especially ought to know very well how painful it is to have claims of iniquity blithely discarded. For trans people, I would draw your attention back to the letter from California and ask you to consider just how unmeetable those requirements currently are. My gender is not up for debate. I am a woman. Any trans discourse that does not proceed from this initial assumption that trans people are the gender they say they are is oppressive, regressive, and harmful. Well, firstly, you might not want your gender to be up for debate, but it just is. And it is not for you or for anyone to set the agenda for other people's free discussion. Secondly, failing to proceed from the assumption that you are the gender that you say you are is not oppressive, no matter how it may harm you personally. And there's no way that you can call for an end to that mentality without yourself calling for a gross act of oppression. I mean, if you look like Carl Weathers but yet identify as a female, then I am absolutely entitled to question your claim. I might be vulgar and unsophisticated in doing so by cosmopolitan terms, but I'm not evil in doing so, because broadly accepted definitions of male and female still have way too much social utility. They are, at this time, way too useful for us to be blithely reconfiguring. Change in a progressive direction will come, I believe. I think it's inevitable. But in the meantime, we're all going to have to acknowledge that there is a controversy. It's not just that you can't win until you acknowledge that there's a conflict. It's also that you can't have a truce until you acknowledge that there is a conflict. And unless you want this shit to go on forever, there's going to have to be a treaty at some point. So why don't we get our papers in order, prepare our questions, book a nice table somewhere, and cut to the chase? I mean, what else are you going to do with your life? Thanks